The lab technician's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the folder twice before she reached the boardroom door. Inside, 12 of the wealthiest men and women in the country were waiting to hear who would inherit an empire worth $11 billion. What they didn't know was that the answer had been sitting in a modest apartment 300 miles away for the last 7 years, laughing at cartoons, completely unaware that his own blood was about to rewrite history. The folder in her hands held a single sheet of paper. One sheet, one number, one name that would collapse a fortress of lies built 7 years ago by a man who was so certain, so utterly convinced, that he never once stopped to ask a single question. He hadn't even looked her in the eyes when he ended it. He'd simply said, "I know the truth," slid a folder across a marble table, and walked out of a woman's life while she stood there, 7 months pregnant, begging him to just listen for one more minute. He never gave her that minute. Now, 7 years later, that same man was about to find out that the minute he refused to give her would cost him everything he thought he'd built his legacy on. Stay with me because this story isn't just about a lie. It's about what happens when the truth waits patiently in the shadows for exactly the right moment to walk back into the light and burn down everything standing in its way. Hello everyone and welcome back. If stories about hidden truths, shattered families, and justice arriving on its own timeline keep you up at night in the best way, make sure you're subscribed, because today's story is one you will not stop thinking about. Let's begin. Nathaniel Cross was 34 years old the year his world ended twice. The first time was the day his father died of a heart attack at his desk, leaving him the sole heir to Cross Dynamics, a logistics and aerospace conglomerate that stretched across 4 continents. Nathaniel had been groomed for that moment since childhood. He knew how to read a balance sheet before he knew how to ride a bike without training wheels. Grief for him had always been something you scheduled around a board meeting. The second time his world ended was quieter. No funeral, no flowers, just a folder on a table and a woman's voice breaking behind him as he walked out a door he would spend the next 7 years pretending he didn't remember. Her name was Amara. She wasn't part of his world, not really. She was a structural engineer, the kind of woman who spent her days calculating stress loads on bridges instead of stress testing hostile takeovers. They'd met when Cross Dynamics broke ground on a shipping terminal in her city, and she'd been the only person in a 200-person planning meeting who had the nerve to tell him point blank that his engineers had underestimated a load-bearing calculation by nearly 9%. He'd been furious. Then he checked the math himself at 2 in the morning and discovered she was right. He showed up at her office the next day, not to apologize but to ask her to dinner. She said no. He asked again 3 days later. She said no again. It took him 11 attempts before she finally agreed, mostly, she told him later, just to get him to stop interrupting her lunch breaks. What started as irritation became something neither of them expected. Amara wasn't impressed by his money. She barely acknowledged it existed. She argued with him about everything: city planning, renewable energy policy, whether pineapple belonged on pizza. And for the first time in his adult life, Nathaniel Cross felt like a person instead of a portfolio. They married quietly, 18 months later, in a small courthouse ceremony that made the business press furious for weeks because nobody got an exclusive. For nearly 3 years it was, by every account that mattered, a genuinely happy marriage. Then Amara got pregnant, and everything Nathaniel Cross thought he understood about loyalty, trust, and family was about to be tested by the one person closest to him. A man who had spent a decade waiting in the wings for exactly this opportunity. His name was Julian Cross, Nathaniel's older half-brother, from their father's first marriage, and the chief operating officer of the company Nathaniel now ran. On paper, Julian was the loyal second in command. In private, he was a man who had watched his younger half-brother inherit a company Julian believed should have been his, a company he had worked inside for 22 years while Nathaniel was still in business school, a company Julian had quietly propped up during 2 recessions while their father took the credit. When their fathers will named Nathaniel as sole heir, something in Julian went cold and calculating. He didn't rage. He didn't contest it. He smiled, congratulated his brother, and started waiting. Julian understood something most people never learn about power. You don't have to take it by force if you can convince the person holding it to hand it to you willingly. All you need is the right lie delivered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right wound. And Nathaniel had a wound. A deep one, buried so far beneath the confidence and the tailored suits that even Amara never fully saw it. Nathaniel had grown up believing he was never quite enough. Not smart enough before he proved otherwise. Not tough enough before he proved otherwise. And underneath all of it, a quieter fear he never said out loud to anyone, that people who claimed to love him were only ever a discovery away from walking out, the way his own mother had when he was 6 years old, vanishing one Tuesday afternoon with a note that said she needed something more than the life she had. Julian had grown up in the same house. He knew exactly where that fear lived. So when Amara was 6 months pregnant, and Nathaniel was buried in the final stages of a hostile acquisition that had him flying between 3 continents in a single week, Julian began, patiently, deliberately, to plant the first seed. "You've been gone a lot lately," Julian mentioned one evening, refilling Nathaniel's glass at the office. "I saw Amara having dinner with Theo Marsh on Tuesday, the structural consultant from the terminal project. Looked pretty deep in conversation." It was true. Amara had been having dinner with Theo Marsh. It was also true that Theo Marsh was gay, married to his husband of 6 years, and the two of them had been discussing a joint proposal for a sustainable housing initiative Amara's firm was bidding on. Julian knew all of that. He just never mentioned it. "I'm sure it's nothing," Julian added in the same practiced, casual tone he'd used to comment on the weather. "You know how people talk." It was nothing on its own. A single comment easily forgotten. But Julian wasn't planting a single seed. He was planting a garden, one offhand remark at a time, always timed for the moments when Nathaniel was too exhausted, too stretched, too far from home to think clearly. A comment about Amara seeming distant. A mention of a late night at the office that wasn't actually late and wasn't actually about work. A photograph cropped just carefully enough to remove context, showing Amara laughing with a male colleague at what looked like an intimate dinner and was, in reality, a farewell party for a coworker moving overseas, a party Nathaniel had been invited to and missed because he was in Singapore closing a deal. Each seed was small enough to dismiss. Together they formed a shape. And then 3 weeks before Amara's due date, Julian delivered the piece that would make the shape undeniable. He requested a private meeting with Nathaniel and placed a folder on the desk between them. Inside were photographs of Amara entering an apartment building late one night. Text messages supposedly pulled from a concerned friend, referencing meetings and feelings that could be read as far more than professional. And underneath all of it, the piece designed to be unquestionable, a document on official-looking letterhead, claiming to be an early prenatal genetic screening that showed a chromosomal marker inconsistent with Nathaniel being the biological father. It was fabricated from beginning to end. The apartment building belonged to Amara's cousin, whom she'd been visiting to help plan a baby shower in secret. The texts were doctored, phrases stitched together out of context by someone with access to her cloud backup, a backdoor Julian had quietly arranged through a private investigator months earlier under the pretense of corporate security concerns. And the genetic document was manufactured by a lab technician Julian was blackmailing over an unrelated billing fraud scheme. A man who would do exactly as told to keep his own secret buried. "I didn't want to believe it either," Julian said, his voice heavy with rehearsed reluctance. "That's why I waited. That's why I made sure before I brought it to you." Nathaniel stared at the folder for a long time. Something in him, some small rational voice, wanted to ask why a legitimate genetic screening would arrive typed on paper instead of through the hospital's actual system. Wanted to ask why the timestamps on the photographs didn't match Amara's actual schedule. Wanted to call the obstetrician directly and simply ask. But the wound Julian had been pressing on for months was no longer a wound. It had become an open door, and every fear Nathaniel had buried since he was 6 years old walked straight through it. He didn't call the doctor. He didn't ask Amara a single question with an open mind. He went home that night, and when Amara looked up from where she was folding tiny clothes into a nursery drawer, glowing, exhausted, and happy in a way she had never quite let herself be with anyone before him, Nathaniel Cross placed the folder on the dresser and said 4 words that would haunt both of them for the next 7 years. "I know the truth." Amara didn't understand at first. She thought something had happened at the company. It took her almost a full minute of confused questions before she understood what he was accusing her of. And by then, Nathaniel had already decided the conversation was over before it started. She begged him to sit down, to actually look at the documents with her. To call the doctor together right then at 9 at night and settle it in 5 minutes instead of destroying 8 years in 5 seconds. He refused. Photographs don't lie, he told her, though even as he said it, some fractured part of him already knew that wasn't true. Then look at me, Amara said, tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed against the curve of her stomach. Look at me and tell me you actually believe I would do this to you. To us. For one single suspended heartbeat, he almost did look at her. He almost let himself see the woman who had built an entire life beside him instead of the fabricated shape of betrayal his brother had spent months carving into his mind. Then he turned, walked out the door and didn't look back. His legal team handled everything from there. The divorce was finalized before their daughter was even born. Amara kept the modest house they'd bought together in her name, though she sold it within the year, unable to stand living inside a home built on a marriage that no longer existed. Nathaniel provided financial support through his attorneys and made it explicitly, coldly clear that he wanted no contact, no updates, and no involvement with a child he had already convinced himself wasn't his. 7 weeks after he walked out, Amara gave birth alone, except for her mother holding one hand and a nurse holding the other, to a boy with a full head of dark hair and a pair of storm-gray eyes that were, unmistakably, unquestionably, his father's. She named him Elias. She sent one letter to Nathaniel's office, along with a single photograph, 2 weeks after his birth. It was returned unopened within the week. She never tried again. If you've ever had someone you trusted choose a lie over you without giving you a single chance to defend yourself, you already understand the particular kind of grief Amara carried for the next 7 years. Not the grief of losing someone, but the grief of never being believed in the first place. But grief, when it has nowhere else to go, has a way of becoming fuel. Amara rebuilt everything from almost nothing. She started her own structural engineering firm 2 years after Elias was born, specializing in resilient infrastructure for coastal cities facing rising flood risk, work that mattered to her precisely because it was the opposite of everything she associated with the world she'd left behind. No boardrooms built on manipulation. No fortunes built on other people's silence. Just concrete, steel, and mathematics that didn't lie the way people did. By the time Elias turned 6, Voss Structural Engineering had 11 employees and a growing reputation for taking on the projects bigger firms considered too complicated or too unglamorous to bother with. She never spoke badly about his father to Elias. Not once. When he asked, as small children eventually always do, she told him only that his father lived far away and worked on very big, very important buildings, and that someday, if the timing was ever right, he might understand more. She didn't know it yet, but the timing was closer than either of them could have imagined. 700 miles away, in a glass office 41 floors above a city that had built half its skyline on Cross Dynamics contracts, Nathaniel Cross was sitting across from a specialist who had just delivered the second piece of devastating news of his adult life. The condition is called dilated cardiomyopathy, the cardiologist explained, sliding an imaging scan across the desk. Given your family history, and the progression we're seeing, I want to be direct with you. Without intervention, we're likely looking at a window measured in years, not decades. And a heart transplant, if it comes to that, isn't guaranteed. Compatible donors for your tissue profile are rare. Nathaniel sat perfectly still, the same way he had 7 years earlier, staring at a folder that would end his marriage. His father had died the exact same way, at 58 at his desk, of a heart that simply gave out under the weight of everything he'd carried and never once slowed down to examine. Nathaniel was 39. The diagnosis alone would have been enough to shake most people to their core. But Nathaniel Cross had spent his entire adult life turning devastating news into problems to be solved, and within days the problem in front of him had a name. Cross Dynamics operated under a succession clause his grandfather had written into the company's founding charter nearly 60 years earlier. A clause designed, at the time, to prevent hostile boards from installing outside leadership during a crisis of succession. The clause was simple, and until this moment, entirely theoretical for Nathaniel's generation. In the event that the sitting CEO becomes medically incapacitated or dies without a confirmed biological heir, controlling interest in Cross Dynamics transfers automatically to the next eligible blood relative on the company's board of directors. There was exactly one other blood relative on that board. Julian Cross. For 7 years, Nathaniel had told himself and everyone around him that he had no children. No heir. No reason the succession clause would ever matter, because he'd convinced himself Amara's child had never been his in the first place. Now, staring down the real, immovable possibility of his own mortality, that conviction started for the first time to crack. It wasn't guilt exactly, not yet. It was something colder and more clinical. A nagging, persistent thought that refused to leave him alone during 3 consecutive sleepless nights. What if I was wrong? He tried to bury the thought the way he'd buried every uncomfortable thought for 7 years, in work. Didn't work this time. The thought kept surfacing at odd moments, during board meetings, during flights, during the quiet hour before sleep when a man's defenses are thinnest. Finally, at 2 in the morning on the 4th sleepless night, Nathaniel did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He opened the drawer where he'd locked away the folder Julian had given him, untouched since the night he walked out of his marriage, and looked at it again with the eyes of a man who was, for the first time, actually afraid of being wrong. What he found made his stomach drop through the floor. The genetic screening document was formatted like nothing his own company's medical consultants had ever seen. There was no hospital letterhead, no accreditation number, no chain of custody documentation, the kind of basic verification any legitimate lab result carries as standard. It looked, now that he was actually looking instead of reacting, less like a medical document and more like something built to resemble one. He didn't sleep at all that night. By 7 the next morning he had summoned his head of corporate security, a quiet, meticulous woman named Priya Anand, who had run internal investigations for Cross Dynamics for over a decade, and had never once brought him a false conclusion. "I need you to verify something for me," he told her, sliding the folder across the desk. "Discreetly. I need to know if this is real." 3 days later, Priya returned to his office with an expression Nathaniel had never seen on her face before. Something between fury and disbelief. "It's not real," she said. "None of it. The lab doesn't exist under that name in any state medical registry. The technician whose signature is on this document was disciplined for falsifying billing records 18 months before this was created. And guess who reported the original complaint that got him disciplined?" She paused. "Julian Cross." Nathaniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. "There's more," Priya continued, and this part came out slower, more carefully, as though she understood exactly what it would do to him. "The photographs. I tracked down the building. It belongs to a woman named Renata Voss, Amara's cousin. Property records show she hosted a baby shower planning meeting there on the exact date in those photos. I found 3 separate vendors who confirmed the appointment. And the texts. Assembled from real messages but heavily edited. I found the original unedited thread on a backup server tied to a corporate security audit. Request submitted 11 months before your daughter, before the pregnancy." She corrected herself, watching him carefully. "Submitted by Julian, citing a fabricated concern about data security on Amara's devices, since she had limited system access through her consulting contract with the company." Nathaniel sat in absolute silence for nearly a full minute. "He built the entire thing," he finally said, not as a question. "He built the entire thing," Priya confirmed. "Every piece of it. Months of preparation. If you've ever had the ground fall out from beneath a belief you'd built years of decisions on top of, you already know the particular kind of vertigo Nathaniel felt in that moment. Not simple guilt. Something closer to watching your own memory rewrite itself in real time. Every scene of the last 7 years reassembling into a shape you never saw because you refused to look. He had a daughter or a son, he realized, and didn't even know which. A child who might be 7 years old by now, who he had never once tried to see, whose letters he'd returned unopened, whose entire existence he had erased from his life based on a lie engineered by his own brother. And underneath that horror sat something colder still. If Julian was capable of building this, the fabricated lab document, the compromised blackmail technician, the surveillance access disguised as corporate security, then Julian had spent months, maybe longer, planning exactly how to end Nathaniel's marriage and clear a path toward exactly the kind of succession crisis Nathaniel now found himself standing inside. The heart condition wasn't Julian's doing. That much, at least, appeared to be simple, brutal biology. But Julian had spent 7 years positioning himself as the loyal brother, the devoted second in command, quietly consolidating relationships across the board of directors, waiting patiently for exactly the moment when Nathaniel's mortality would finally catch up with his family history. He didn't create the crisis. He simply built the perfect trap to be waiting at the bottom of it. Nathaniel picked up his phone and made 2 calls that morning. The first was to Priya, instructing her to quietly, carefully, begin building a complete, court-admissible case against his brother. Every falsified document, every compromised employee, every altered file, assembled with the kind of precision that would leave no room for denial. The second call took him almost 20 minutes to work up the nerve to make. He didn't call Amara directly. He didn't feel he had earned that yet. Instead, he called a private investigator with no connection to Cross Dynamics and asked for one simple piece of information. Was there a child, and if so, where? The answer came back within 2 days. Elias Voss, age 7, residing with his mother, Amara Voss, founder and principal engineer of Voss Structural Engineering. Nathaniel stared at the boy's name on the report for nearly an hour before he could make himself move. He didn't show up at her door unannounced this time. He understood, with a clarity that came far too late, that he had already taken enough from her without warning once. Instead, he wrote a letter by hand, the first genuinely honest piece of writing he'd produced in 7 years, and had it delivered along with a formal request through his attorney for a paternity test, not as a demand, not as a legal maneuver, but as an admission that he had been catastrophically wrong, and needed proof before he had any right to ask for anything else. Amara read that letter sitting at her kitchen table while Elias did homework in the next room, and for the first time in 7 years, her hand shook so hard she had to set it down twice before finishing it. She almost didn't respond at all. Part of her, the part that had spent 7 years building a life specifically designed not to need him, wanted to burn the letter and never think about Nathaniel Cross again. But another part of her, the part that had watched her son ask increasingly specific questions about a father he'd never met, understood that this wasn't only her decision to make anymore. She agreed to the test. Nothing more. No promises, no reunion, no forgiveness implied. Just the test, conducted through an independent, court-verified lab neither of them had any connection to. The results would take 11 days. Those 11 days were, by Nathaniel's own admission later, the longest of his life, longer even than the days following his father's death. Longer than the night the cardiologist gave him a number of years instead of decades. He canceled every non-essential meeting. He stopped sleeping in any meaningful way. He found himself standing in his office at 3 a.m, staring at the city skyline his family's company had helped build, wondering how a man who could calculate the structural tolerance of a 40-story building down to a fraction of a percent could have looked at the person who loved him most and simply refused to check his math. On the 10th day, Julian, sensing something had shifted, requested an unscheduled meeting. "You've been distant," Julian said, settling into the chair across from Nathaniel's desk with the same easy, practiced warmth he'd used for 7 years. "Everything all right? I heard you met with Priya's team a few times this week. Everything okay with security?" Nathaniel studied his brother for a long moment, the same face he'd trusted his entire life, the same voice that had, piece by piece, quietly poisoned the most important relationship he'd ever had. "Everything's fine," Nathaniel said evenly. "Just handling some old business." Julian smiled, and for the first time, Nathaniel saw something behind that smile he had never let himself see before. Not warmth. Calculation. "Let me know if you need anything," Julian said, rising to leave. "You know I've always got your back." Nathaniel waited until the door closed behind him before letting his hands, finally visibly shake. On the 11th day, the results arrived in a sealed envelope hand-delivered to Nathaniel's office by a courier from the lab. Priya stood beside him as he opened it, not because he asked her to, but because she suspected, correctly, that he might not be able to make his hands work on his own. The number on the page wasn't a percentage most people would recognize as meaningful at a glance. But Nathaniel had spent enough of the last 11 days reading about paternity testing to understand exactly what it meant the instant he saw it. 99.9997% probability of paternity. Elias Voss was his son. Nathaniel Cross, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without his pulse changing, sat down on the floor of his own office, because his legs simply stopped working, and did something he hadn't done since he was 6 years old, standing at a window watching his mother's car disappear down a driveway. He cried completely without restraint, for the first time in over 3 decades. He had a son. A 7-year-old boy with, according to the photograph the investigator had included, dark hair and storm gray eyes exactly like his own, who had spent his entire life without a father because Nathaniel had chosen a lie over the woman who loved him, without giving her 30 seconds to defend herself. If you've ever discovered that a single decision you made, in a moment of fear, quietly rewrote the entire shape of someone else's life without your knowledge, you understand exactly the weight that settled onto Nathaniel Cross in that moment. Not simply regret. Something closer to grief for a version of the last 7 years that could have existed and never would now, no matter what he did next. But grief, for a man like Nathaniel, has always eventually turned into motion. He called Amara that same afternoon. Not through his attorney. Directly. She almost didn't answer. When she finally did, her voice was guarded, careful, the voice of someone who had learned, through hard experience, exactly how much a person's certainty is worth when it turns out to be built on nothing. "I got the results," he said. Silence stretched on the line for so long he genuinely wasn't sure she was still there. "I know," she finally said. "I got mine an hour ago." "Amara, don't," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that told him 7 years of composure was finally quietly breaking apart. "Don't say you're sorry. Not yet. Sorry is a word you say when you spill coffee on someone's shirt. What you did." She stopped, took a breath, started again. "You are going to have to earn the right to say that word to me. If you ever get there at all. Then let me try," Nathaniel said. "Please. I know I have no right to ask for anything. Not from you and especially not from him. But let me try." There was another long silence. "He asks about you sometimes," Amara finally said quietly. "Not often. But sometimes. He's smart, Nathaniel. Frighteningly smart. He's going to have questions you can't answer with a paternity test result." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness today. I'm asking for a chance to eventually earn it. On whatever terms you decide." She was quiet for a long time before she spoke again. "I need to think," she said. "Give me a week." She hung up before he could respond, and Nathaniel sat alone in his office, holding a phone that had gone silent, understanding with total clarity that the hardest negotiation of his life wasn't waiting for him in a boardroom. It was waiting for him in a modest house 400 miles away, in the shape of a woman he'd broken and a son who didn't yet know he existed to him at all. But Nathaniel Cross wasn't the only person whose entire future had just been rewritten by a single sheet of paper. Word travels fast inside a company the size of Cross Dynamics, and it travels fastest through exactly the kind of people who make it their business to know everything before anyone else does. Within 6 days of the results arriving, Julian Cross knew that his brother had ordered a paternity test, knew the results had come back positive, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man watching a decade of careful planning collapse in real time, exactly what that meant for him. If Nathaniel had a confirmed biological heir, the succession clause that had quietly anchored Julian's entire strategy for the last several years was worthless. There would be no crisis of succession for Julian to inherit his way into. There would be, instead, a legitimate heir with a legal claim stronger than anything Julian had ever held. And worse, far worse, Julian understood that Priya Anand's security team hadn't spent the last week and a half simply verifying a lab document out of idle curiosity. If they'd found the fabricated document, they'd found the technician he'd blackmailed. If they'd found the technician, they were likely working backward through every piece of the plan he had built 7 years earlier, piece by careful piece. Julian had 2 choices, and he understood both of them with total cold precision. He could wait, calmly, for the walls to close in around him, and hope his brother's evident emotional turmoil over the child would somehow distract him long enough to negotiate a soft landing. Or he could act immediately, decisively, the way he always had, and try to control the story before Nathaniel could control it first. He chose the second option, and in doing so, made the single greatest miscalculation of his entire life. 3 days later, on the morning Nathaniel had scheduled a private, informal meeting with Amara to discuss, carefully and on her terms, the possibility of finally meeting his son, Julian requested an emergency session of the full board of directors. He stood in front of 11 board members, along with Nathaniel, and delivered, in the same warm, practiced, trustworthy voice he'd used for 7 years, a carefully constructed narrative designed to strike first. He claimed that Nathaniel's recent health diagnosis had visibly compromised his judgment. He cited the sudden, unexplained paternity test as evidence of erratic personal decision-making, rather than the truth. He suggested, delicately, without ever quite saying it outright, that perhaps it was time for the board to consider a leadership transition, for the good of the company, while Nathaniel focused on his health. What Julian did not know, standing there in front of the board, delivering the performance of his life, was that Priya Anand was sitting quietly in the back of that same room, having been invited by Nathaniel that morning for exactly this reason, holding a tablet containing 7 years of digital evidence, timestamps, financial transfers, and a signed statement from the blackmailed lab technician who, once confronted with the full weight of Priya's investigation and offered immunity from the fraud allegations Julian had used to control him, had agreed to tell the truth. Nathaniel let his brother finish the entire speech. Let him reach the natural conclusion of his argument. Let the room settle into the uncomfortable silence that follows a suggestion that a sitting CEO should step aside. Then he stood up. "Before the board votes on anything," Nathaniel said, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him, "I think everyone deserves to hear how my son came to be a paternity test result instead of a birth certificate 7 years ago." Julian's expression flickered, just slightly, the first genuine crack anyone in that room had ever seen in his composure. Nathaniel nodded to Priya, who rose, connected her tablet to the boardroom display, and over the course of the next 23 minutes, laid out every piece of what Julian had spent months building 7 years earlier. The unregistered lab. The blackmailed technician, whose recorded statement played for the room in his own voice. The doctored photographs, cross-referenced against the actual property and vendor records from Renata Voss's home. The edited text messages, shown side by side with the original, unaltered thread pulled from a backup server Julian himself had authorized access to under false pretenses. By the time Priya reached the final piece of evidence, a financial trail showing payments from an account linked to Julian to the lab technician's personal accounts, timed precisely around the fabrication of the false document, the room was in absolute, stunned silence. Julian tried once to speak. This is being taken out of context, There is no context," Nathaniel said quietly. "That explains why you paid a man to fabricate a document proving my son wasn't mine, 3 weeks before he was born." Julian's face went pale, then slowly cold. The mask he had worn for 7 years finally, completely, fell away, and what remained underneath wasn't apologetic or panicked. It was something closer to the bitter, resentful truth Julian had been carrying since the day their father's will was read. "You had everything," Julian said, his voice low, shaking, no longer performing for anyone. "You always had everything. The company, the name, the wife, the family I was never allowed to have because I was too busy propping up a business you barely showed up for half the time. I built half of what this company became in the last decade, and you got the title because of an accident of birth order. Was I supposed to just watch you get the rest, too? The perfect family on top of everything else. So you destroyed it," Nathaniel said, "instead of asking me for a single thing." "I didn't want your charity," Julian spat. "You didn't want my family," Nathaniel corrected, quietly, and the room felt the full weight of that distinction settle over it. "There's a difference, Julian, and it's the only reason I'm not the one who understands what you did. I'm just the one it happened to." The board vote that followed was unanimous and swift. Julian Cross was removed from his position, from the board, and from the company entirely, with the full board's blessing to pursue every possible legal consequence, criminal and civil, that Priya's evidence supported. He did not go quietly. He tried, in the weeks that followed, to leak a distorted version of the story to the press, painting himself as a scapegoat for a company covering up a health crisis in its leadership. It didn't work. Priya's evidence was too complete, too well documented, and once the story broke publicly on Nathaniel's own terms, with the full truth laid out rather than hidden, public sympathy moved entirely in the opposite direction Julian had hoped for. He was indicted 11 weeks later on charges of fraud, unauthorized surveillance, and witness intimidation related to the blackmailed lab technician. He eventually pled guilty to a reduced set of charges in exchange for a lengthy probation and full financial restitution, a fraction of what he'd taken from 7 years of quietly siphoning influence and resources meant for the company he claimed to love more than his own brother did. But the story of Julian's downfall, however dramatic, was never really the center of what mattered most in this story. The center of it was 400 miles away, in a modest house with a swing set in the backyard, where a 7-year-old boy with storm-gray eyes was about to meet his father for the first time. Amara had thought about that first meeting more times than she could count over the past week, running through every version of how it might go, every way it might fall apart. In the end, she decided the only way to do it honestly was simply, without staging it into something bigger than it needed to be. Nathaniel arrived on a Saturday afternoon, dressed deliberately plainly, in jeans instead of a suit, understanding correctly that whatever this moment needed, it wasn't the CEO of Cross Dynamics. Elias was in the backyard when Amara brought Nathaniel through the house, building something elaborate out of wooden blocks that had clearly been under construction for days. "Elias," Amara said gently, kneeling down beside him, "there's someone here who'd like to meet you." The boy looked up, studying the stranger standing awkwardly in his backyard with an intensity that reminded Nathaniel, with a jolt, of exactly the way he used to study a balance sheet before he understood what any of the numbers meant. "Is this my dad?" Elias asked, with the blunt, unfiltered directness only children seem capable of. Nathaniel felt his throat close entirely. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "My name is Nathaniel," he said carefully. "And yes, I'm your father." Elias considered this with the same serious focus he'd been giving his block structure. "Mom said you lived far away and didn't know about me," Elias said. "Because someone told you a lie." "That's true," Nathaniel said, his voice rough. "Someone told me a very bad lie, and I believed it instead of finding out the truth myself. That was my mistake, and it's the biggest one I've ever made. I'm sorry it cost us 7 years." Elias studied him a moment longer. "Are you going to leave again?" The question landed like a blow, exactly as hard as it was meant to, though Nathaniel understood the boy hadn't asked it to hurt him. He'd asked it because he needed to know. "No," Nathaniel said, and meant it with everything he had left in him. "I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. You have my word for whatever that's worth to you right now. I intend to spend the rest of however much time I have proving it's worth something." Elias glanced at his mother, who gave the smallest encouraging nod, and then with the swift, uncomplicated forgiveness only children seem able to offer, held up a wooden block. "Do you want to help me finish this? It's supposed to be a bridge, but it keeps falling down in the middle." Nathaniel Cross, who had negotiated deals worth more money than most countries generate in a year, who had just survived the collapse of a plot to destroy his life and his company, sat down cross-legged in the grass beside a boy he had missed the first 7 years of, and studied a half-built wooden bridge with the same seriousness he'd once given his father's company ledgers. "You need more support in the center span," he said. "Same problem happens with real bridges. Want me to show you?" Elias's face lit up with the kind of delight that comes from finding an unexpected kindred spirit. "You know about bridges?" "I know a little," Nathaniel said, and for the first time in 7 years, something in his chest that had been clenched tight since the night he walked out a door finally slowly began to loosen. Amara watched them from the porch, her arms crossed, her expression a complicated mixture of things that didn't have a single name. Relief. Old anger that hadn't fully faded and might never entirely disappear. And underneath it something that looked, if you knew her well enough to recognize it, almost like the beginning of hope. The road that followed wasn't simple, and it wasn't fast. Trust, once broken as completely as Nathaniel had broken it, doesn't rebuild itself in an afternoon, no matter how sincere the apology or how quickly a child accepts a stranger into his life. Amara made it clear in the months that followed that whatever relationship developed between herself and Nathaniel, if any developed at all, would happen slowly on terms she controlled, built through consistency rather than declarations. Nathaniel accepted every condition without argument, because for the first time in his life, he understood the difference between wanting something and deserving it, and he was willing to spend however many years he had left closing that gap. He restructured cross-dynamic succession framework within the year, not around the outdated blood heir clause his grandfather had written 60 years earlier, but around a modern governance structure that protected the company from ever again being vulnerable to the kind of manipulation Julian had built his entire plan around. He didn't do it to protect Elias's inheritance. He did it because he never wanted another family to be torn apart by the kind of institutional vulnerability that had nearly cost him everything that actually mattered. His heart condition remained a constant, quiet pressure in the background of every decision he made from that point forward. A daily reminder of exactly how little time anyone is guaranteed and exactly how much of it he had already wasted on a lie he never once questioned. He underwent treatment, made every lifestyle change his doctors recommended, and slowly, carefully, without ever making promises he couldn't keep, built a relationship with his son built on Saturday visits, phone calls, and eventually, when Amara finally decided the time was right, in his life on a more permanent basis. 2 years after that first meeting in the backyard, on Elias's 9th birthday, Nathaniel stood beside Amara, watching their son blow out candles surrounded by friends from school and cousins from a family that had finally, slowly, healed enough to gather in one room again, and understood with total clarity that everything he had once believed made a legacy worth building, the company, the fortune, the empire spanning 4 continents, had never actually been the legacy that mattered at all. The real legacy had been sitting in a modest house 400 miles away the entire time, waiting patiently for the truth to finally catch up. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this: certainty is not the same thing as truth, and the two are most dangerous exactly when they feel identical. A single unquestioned assumption, born from an old wound and fed by someone who understood exactly where to press, cost Nathaniel Cross 7 years he can never get back, and nearly cost him a son he now can't imagine his life without. The truth doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes it arrives years late, wrapped in grief and consequence and the particular ache of knowing exactly how much simpler everything could have been if someone had simply asked one honest question instead of believing a folder full of lies. But when it finally does arrive, it has a way of rebuilding what certainty once destroyed, one patient, deliberate, honest choice at a time. If this story moved you, stay close because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the quiet lies that shape entire lives, and the truths brave enough to eventually undo them. Until next time, take care of each other, and never mistake certainty for the truth.